time to ultimately do a skills transfer in order to train our own internal drone operators, which allows us to have eyes in the sky. Currently, as it's being operated, our current service providers, we do run the same system where we've got eyes in the sky for reaction and monitoring. The PRASA protection services, as I said previously, in our formulated plan, and it's been implemented, has started to bear great fruits through the interventions and through the various integrated approaches with communities, SMMEs, and various service providers. We've had a decrease of over 75% in theft and vandalism. And noting the fact that the corridors are coming back and the decrease is still happening. So there's a definite hands-on approach in terms of security. I've outlined in this presentation and shows how we're fighting against the crime and corruption that we face, the protection of assets, and also due to the integrated security approach, we've dealt with what people term the construction mafia. In Cape Town, obviously, we faced in a certain element when it comes to construction mafia. The same thing we will face in the KZN region when it comes to the construction mafia and the business forums, as well as in Gauteng when we look at more within our outskirts areas there. We have the same approach there. But the nice thing about our integrated plan, it's an all-inclusive. So people do take part that actually live in and amongst our rail infrastructure or on the outskirts of our rail infrastructure that have been integrated. And this has proved a great success in terms of our fight back to take back our rail. As the Honourable Minister had mentioned, one of the main issues at PRASA that is also a bit of concern is the funding, specifically in the protection services. Initially, a lot of funding is needed as we are doing and managing from a deployment perspective, because we have got warm bodies managing the infrastructure. And over the period of time, within the next 3 years, we are deploying what we call our phase 2 technologies. And over time, the warm bodies then become reduced, and then we follow a model of prevention is better than cure, because our systems have got those early warning and management, as well as the command and control via our C4I project. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, before we move to the next section, which is on irregular expenditure, Alex, can you just give an update on Philippi? Yeah, please.
Sure. So one of the projects that we've developed is called Project Irregular. And what it was is, unfortunately, PRASA is not in the business of relocations. And while waiting for the HTA as well as the City of Cape Town with regards to identifying the land, PRASA has taken an approach where we've started implementing what is called Project Irregular. And if colleagues note, 5 months ago, if you visited the Philippi area and you had stood at the Philippi station itself, you wouldn't be able to see any of the rail. So what we did then is we worked together with the communities and the integration in order to shift the current shacks that were interfering 10 meters away from our infrastructure. And we started infilling. We have gotten to a point now where there's approximately 800 shacks in the way from between Nyanga, specifically on the Nyanga side, towards Philippi. And what we have done is we've identified land in terms of PRASA's land by Stock Road, which is a temporary measure. And colleagues will note that at the end of May, as the Chair said, one would note that we would have completed the 800 temporary move to the Stock Road, which then allows from the beginning of next month, it allows our OHTE contractors as well as the per-way contractors to start rebuilding that infrastructure. That's one of the projects that the late Loiso Nkola really assisted PRASA with in terms of assisting with communities living within that infrastructure. So that project is moving. There's been, as I said, if one goes towards Philippi and walks along the line there, you would note that it's actually starting to clear out, where we've got just the one pocket which will be cleared out by the end of this month, and then allows the train and the formation, the contractors to get in there so that we can join Nyanga to Philippi and then move from, obviously, Philippi onwards, Captain's Clip, on the way to Chris Hani and Kailicha. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Alex. The next, can I get the acting CPO, Mr. Asif Rahman, to present this section? Asif?
Good morning, Honorable Chair, members of SCOPA, Honorable Minister, Deputy Minister, and the Director General of Transport, members of the PRASA Board, members from SIU, members from the Auditor General, the media, as well as my colleagues from Group EXCO at PRASA. Thank you, colleagues. I will take you through the irregular expenditure as we have been reporting in terms of our regular interventions and meetings within PRASA to bring down and reduce the irregular expenditure that we are saddled with at PRASA. At the beginning of April 2022, the opening balance of irregular expenditure was at 30.49 billion. In the financial year that we have actually concluded, the irregular expenditure recorded was 428 million, taking the closing balance as at the 31st of March 2023 to 30.9 billion. We have concluded the condemnation process in terms of the determination test and the loss control, and submitted it to the regulatory authority where the condemnation needs to be approved. That's sitting at 12.350 billion. Then in terms of condemnations that are being subjected to the determination test, which is currently with our internal audit team, supported by a co-source partner in terms of SNG, the total value is sitting at 9.6 billion. And lastly, we have a value of 8.9 billion, which is currently being addressed by the various business units to finalize the condemnation submissions as well as the supporting documentation that will then be submitted to internal audit to undertake the loss control and determination test. Thank you. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yes. In terms of the graph that is projected, it basically shows a downward trend in terms of irregular expenditure. The irregular expenditure has been decreasing since the financial year 2016-17, with a notable decrease in the financial year 1920. The reason for the notable decrease, it's the advent of the pandemic, which was COVID. There was minimal spend during that period, hence the decrease in irregular expenditure during that period. However, the increase in the subsequent years to the spending on those contracts previously declared irregular. Majority of the contracts that have been declared irregular are multi-year projects, so they span over 3 to 5 years. Once the process is concluded, the irregular expenditure will be subjected to the regulatory authority where the transgression applies. As I said earlier, management is addressing the 8.9 billion irregular expenditure, which is yet to be submitted to the determination test, will be undertaken by group internal audit. Supply chain management has put in place initiatives to enhance the controls. We have updated our SCM policy. We have developed standard operating procedures. We have continuous training on SCM staff, as well as members who sit on the bid committees There are ongoing training in terms of instruction notes, directives issued by the regulatory authority to curb and also to educate the respective individuals in terms of the elements that governs SCM. Thank you. In terms of there are 6 transactions that have been concluded to a total value of 12.3 billion. 2 is currently sitting at National Treasury at a value of 41.9 billion. 12.3 billion has been submitted to National Treasury. There were certain questions which we have addressed and submitted back to National Treasury. In terms of further interventions that we have put in place, the Group CEO has mentioned earlier, we have increased capacity within SCM to identify and detect irregular expenditure, fast-track the condonation process, as well as the removal of irregular expenditure from the financial statements. Management has instituted internal and forensic investigation for the condonation of irregular expenditure. Furthermore, the SIU is assisting PRASA with investigations. In terms of our high-value tenders, we've also put in a process where we got external assurance through probity. We appoint external teams to basically sit in all aspects of bid committees to ensure that the process is compliant with both legislation, prescripts, as well as the supply chain management policy, that when it gets to the delegated authority, all those tick boxes are checked and that the process is fair and void of any irregularities. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Chair, we then move on to the next section, which deals with progress on the SIU investigations as well as disciplinary matters. Now, Lady.
Thank you very much, Group CEO. Good morning, Honorable Chair, SCOPA members, Honorable Minister, Deputy Minister, DG of Transport, Board of Control of PRASA, and colleagues, good morning all. I am just going to take you through the progress that has been made to date in relation to the SIU investigation and the outcomes thereof. In total, there was about 33 cases. Of those 33 cases, 28 of them has currently been completed. And if we then go back, the breakdown for those cases are as follows. The dismissals that resulted in those cases were 2 of them. The resignations were 2. Final written warnings that came out were about 6. Written warnings about 2. Not guilty, about 13 of them. No action taken, it was about 2, and only 1 for early retirement. So currently only 5 cases that are still ongoing in relation to the SIU investigation. Employee 1 is just on a matter of fair disqualification of bidders, and here all of these cases from employee 1 up to until employee 34 actually running in between the whole of this week, and in the next 2 to 3 weeks, I think this is where we will then be for getting the outcome of these cases and bringing them to totality and finality once and for all. Employee 5, there is just that where the line manager was found there is no prima facie misconduct in respect to the material irregularities. But however, I think caution must be taken because there was another point, or there was another charge that was actually put into the employee in relation to the very same cases. Next slide, please. So these are the categories of the disciplinary interventions. And when you look at the categories of the misconduct, 3 of the employees were actually charged on procurement and related irregularities, 7 on fraud and theft, 2 on irregular expenditure, gross negligence, about 3 employees, misconduct and gross misconduct, about 15, honesty and gross dishonesty, about 2. I think that meant gross dishonesty. Under investigation, it's still about 7. So in all, we have about the number of suspensions that are currently there. It's about 39. This is a combination of management and also junior staff. So these are some of the disciplinary interventions that currently happen, and after investigations, either the suspensions will be lifted or, where appropriate, or there could be an alternative placement where appropriate during a disciplinary process. That will be the outcome of the hearing. Or there could be a settlement agreement between the parties, and where applicable also, an employee can opt for early retirement, depends on where they are in terms of their age. And also they can opt for an expedited disciplinary processes through written submissions instead of the full disciplinary hearings. The other option could be the presiding officers of the disciplinary hearing. They also have the vested powers in determining the validity of any applications and procedures that are actually brought by the employees. So PRASA, we often conduct a pre-hearing conferences at first sitting of the disciplinary hearings. So therefore, after the parties therefore agree on a time for filling of those preliminary and interlocutory applications. This is just to try and shorten the process of many applications that might come after when the process have already started. Next slide, please. I think this is on project. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Naledi. Honourable members, just in terms of Project Zivusele, we also reported this at the last meeting we had with SCOPA, where we also clarified at the time the reference to the 3,000 coast workers, where that 3,000 related to actual number of staff that had not verified themselves as yet and were not necessarily ghost workers. The team at PRASA have done further work in terms of the investigation around, let's call it our employee, the database. What we had found as part of that investigation through security and HCM in the main, that there was a figure of approximately 2,200, where this relates to exceptions that we found in terms of various categories. These are not necessarily ghosts. Through that investigation, we found that there were issues of questions around qualifications, confirmation of qualifications, issues around criminal record, and then also what we could define as ghosts. The team, particularly around the issue of confirmation of qualifications, affidavits from SAP in terms of the criminal records and also the SERA qualifications. We had given those colleagues 3 weeks to respond and confirm that. When that was not done, salaries were stopped around that, and then we saw a quick submission of documentation around those things. Now, the figure of the 2,200, and the colleagues will come in, also relates to where we can call it those persons have exited the system since we started the process. When Project Zivusele was started, we were reporting on an employee, if I can call it, total employee number sitting at over 17,000 employees at PRASA. As per our latest report, which is April this year, the total employee numbers is sitting at 15,500. And some of that is where we've seen some of this exit the system during this period. Now, the issue around what we have done, which is very important, is there's no doubt there are internal control lapses and weaknesses within the system. HCM in particular, we've made sure we implement certain controls to tighten around this, down to the level of each line manager having to sign off on who is in your department, who is working, who should be paid, down to that level. But over and above that, I think to properly close this item around Zivusele and the issue of our weaknesses in terms of internal controls, which in the main is sitting at HCM, but also you've got control lapses sitting at ICT. You've got control lapses sitting within finance. We did report, Honourable Chair, at the last meeting we wanted to appoint forensic investigators to come in and drill into all of those departments, identify those weaknesses so that we can close it. I was hoping that by today, when we present to the committee, I could confirm we have made the award of the forensic investigators. And this is into HCM, it's into ICT, it's into finance, it's into SCM. Unfortunately, we could not make the award. I've still given the assurance that by the end of this week, the appointment will be finalized for these forensic investigators. I would like, as myself, the management team, that we can report to the minister, to our shareholder and the board, a clear outcome and process around Project Zivusele, so that this matter is properly reported on and also closed in terms of going forward. For now, what we can give you is that update that we are sitting with. I'm hopeful once we have got these teams on board, we can then present that plan, that program on closing this thing properly in terms of Project Zivusele. So we've indicated some of those steps we've taken internally just to tighten controls. Within the HCM environment, we are automating a lot of our processes in terms of moving on to SAP, cleaning up our current record system, and also ensuring through the confirmation of our organizational design structures that people are allocated within the org structures appropriately. So that process is ongoing. We've started at the head office level. That is being rolled out now down to a regional level. So that's some of the progress. I think with the appointment of these teams into these various aspects, we will be able to drill down and close on these weaknesses that I think has clearly come up in terms of these critical departments. Is there anything, Naledi, Alex, you want to add on this item?
Thank you, Chair. I think it's also important to note, while the forensic is happening, those cases that are clear-cut have got a whole list of criminal charges, so case numbers of the investigation. One of the findings, if I may just give you one example, is when we trace a so-called ghost worker, we don't have an employment file. A person is on the system. Once you track that specific ID number, you then end up with a person that will tell you, I've never been employed at PRASA. That's the first part. The second part is when you trace the bank account, the items that have been traced to this day, you would find that a syndication would operate whereby they would approach someone in a township and ask them if they can go and open a bank account. The person would then go with this individual to open a bank account at a Capitec, to give you an example. And on that same day, the card plus the OTP plus the cell phone number being used to manage that bank account is not even being done by that owner. So that's just one example of giving you the understanding of how deep we are going as protection services together with law enforcement in analyzing the case-for-case matter, and obviously finalizing what is needed from a forensic perspective, looking at our shortfalls of our internal systems, as the Group CEO has said. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Chair, the last section, Honourable Chair, under the corrective measures deals with...
But the Group CEO is saying they have not appointed as yet the forensics. So you are saying that's why the forensics are happening. Maybe at some stage we'll...
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Apologies. We're on to the next item, and this is the last item under Part A, which deals with the corrective measures, the audit improvement plan. This is a critical one that we put a lot of attention to try and turn things and show progress on our side. Mr. Krishna Govender, if you can just speak to these few slides, Chair, and then we'll move on to Part B after that. Thank you.
Good morning, Honourable Chairperson, SCOPA members, Honourable Minister, Deputy Minister, DG, Board of Control members, Group CEO, and colleagues. Chair, just in terms of the starting point, subsequent to the close of the last external audit, I think it was clear that we had to focus our attention on key specific things that emanated out of that external audit process. I think in the main, understanding those key areas, particularly from our fixed asset management perspective, irregular expenditure, then from a commitment perspective, particularly the material contracts that exist within PRASA and how we understand those contracts, how we manage those contracts, and then lastly, how do they culminate themselves in terms of the disclosures from a GRAP perspective into the financial statements. And then just lastly, I think the other core sort of area that we focused on is the financial discipline in the organization. And we framed it as what we call financial close process. Inherently, what we found is all processes, again, culminate themselves into an annualized year-end process rather than a monthly process, particularly from a discipline perspective. One slide back. So I think just in terms of understanding that and what the root causes that have contributed to that, I think we try to understand from a control perspective, and in order to implement the right and relevant controls, particularly around skills mix and resources in order to deal and close those gaps. Secondly, from a process perspective, what are the right operating processes that allow us to get to close the root causes related to these issues? And then I think just lastly, from an ICT perspective, particularly from a workflow perspective, is related to automation as much as we can to bypass manual processes so that we just have a greater sense in terms of the data integrity that resides in our various systems. So that's essentially how we built the plan. And I think it was always going to be a time-based plan, particularly around milestones that we are trying to achieve. And just lastly, from a monitoring, reporting, and an accountability perspective, we flowed it through the Group Exco into the Audit and Risk Committee, particularly on a monthly basis that found itself into the Board of Control. Then, Chair, just in terms of the key issues, we understand the audit previously was disclaimed around fixed assets, property, plant, and equipment. So just in terms of, I think the first initiative around arresting our asset register, where we had the ability to give and hand over to the Auditor General some semblance of a credible register that is supported by various transactions, etc. We undertook to understand that we required to undertake a physical verification of that asset base. And in that regard, we had brought in Siemens, who had the right technology at that point in time to be able to assist us in terms of the short timeline that we had to the financial year end. I think this slide, I'm not going to go through all the detail, but I think what it is meant to articulate is in the main the robust sort of planning process that we undertook, because we had clarity of mind. We want to plan this properly so that we do not have to repeat these processes again in years to come. So that in the main is the purpose of this slide. If you can move to the next slide, which culminates into the results of that verification process. So you'll see we started fairly late in terms of the process, but be that as it may, we managed to achieve in 6 weeks a fairly high level of verification, particularly in the areas where we were hamstrung in the previous external audit cycles. And that in the main is around network assets. I think just from a verification perspective, as much as the numbers are there, I think just at an overall level, including the assets under construction, we managed to achieve around 68% through this external verification process. It must be stated that I think as part of that process, there also was internal verifications that were done by teams across the various regions, etc., that would then form part of the overall assessment in terms of trying to achieve 100% verification. I think the second to last bullet speaks to the automation related to this. I think in years gone by, we have always undertaken physical verification, but the process to get that data then back into the SAP environment was a manual process. So typically you've got anywhere between 60 to 70,000 lines of assets. So you can only imagine how long it takes from a manual perspective. So at the back end, we automated this so that the right information flows back through an automation and an upload process, and we've managed to successfully do that. If we can move to the next slide. I think just culminating and leading up to the annual financial statement process and submission, I think there's just a few items that still remain outstanding in order to achieve that. I think in the main, it relates to particularly the GRAP compliance aspects. One around conditional assessment that was achieved through the external verification, but and what that means in terms of various accounting entries that need to be processed around impairments, reassessment of useful lives related to assets that exist in the field, etc. And then just lastly, I think we struggled in the previous years to provide asset reconciliations that were in terms of the balances that were disclosed on the financials and what resided in our asset registers. And I think we're closer to the answer in terms of what we'd be able to provide to the AG this year. If we can move to the next slide. Chair, then the other material area which we had disclaimed on was the space related to commitments. I'm sure we all appreciate that Gibela is our material contract running into billions at PRASA. In the previous year or the previous audit cycle, we had quite a few what we term indexation. So it's the annual increases that are meant to be reflected in the contract. Those were outstanding for 2 years. One on the main contract and one on the capital spares and tools aspect, which
You
is
have 3 minutes, huh?
No problem, Chair.
Yeah.
I'm almost at the end. So I think in terms of that, we've managed to conclude those processes. I think from a financial perspective, we've closed all the calculations, and we, at a fairly advanced stage, having shared that information with the AG in terms of a mini interim audit process in order to get us to the financial statement submission. Next slide. Then, Chair, just lastly, I think in terms of the financial close process, which I've spoken to earlier, I think just from a resource perspective, we've brought in some resources in order to assist us in various areas. One, from a financial statement preparation perspective, and it has coverage across all the key areas, particularly assets, irregular, fruitless, wasteful expenditure, and then some of the other material balances that reside in the financial statements. I think also just from a resource perspective and understanding compliance as being one of the key areas, we've managed to recruit a structure or